I'm an author. I've written 8 books. I'm not native to Texas, but I live about an hour from here. I have a little farm, which it sounds like Tim is also exploring. My books are about marketing, and then about ancient philosophy, which is sort of a strange transition, I know, but hopefully we'll get into that sort of merging. What I try to write about is how people overcome obstacles internally and externally, and then how we use sort of the wisdom of the past to be better in the present.
Yeah. And so we're missing a lot of people, but those of you in the room who have read Ego is the Enemy was one of the assigned books, and we had 3 of them do a book report on it earlier.
Oh, awesome.
The funny part was, is I'd originally scheduled the book report to happen like a year.
Oh, that would be
and
very
they actually asked me for them.
Yeah, and you.
Yeah, and so they asked me not to do it. So these are some of your books. Did you bring these mine?
I did.
Very cool. I'm sure that we're not allowed to keep these because.
No, we can give them away.
Oh no, I'm going to keep them.
All right, then
Autograph them too. All right, so we had a lot of interesting questions.
Okay.
Specifically about this book.
Okay.
So, I mean, frankly, we went online.
Yeah.
Remember, you didn't help me with questions.
I did help you with questions.
You did.
He basically tried to get me to interview myself.
I asked him to write his own questions. I admit it. Okay, because I want to do a good job for everyone. So we polled the audience, and we have thousands of people that are watching right now on the internet.
Okay.
One of the most respected authors of our generation. So feel a little study uppy.
Okay.
And so the big question they had about this book
Yeah.
specifically
Yeah.
is what is the deal with your obsession and with Hulk Hogan's naked pictures?
It's weird. So the book is about this sort of 10-year battle and conspiracy between Peter Thiel, the billionaire, one of the first investors in Facebook, founder of PayPal, and Gawker Media. And sort of, if that wasn't a weird enough story, in between there's Hulk Hogan, who has sex with his best friend's wife, and then he's illegally recorded while doing so. And then Gawker runs the tape, and this is how Peter ends up suing them, and it's sort of the means that he uses to get at Gawker. The weird part about that thing in the book is, as I had to read something like 20,000 pages of legal documents as I was researching the book. And so the whole question is like, can this media outlet run this tape? And is it private? Is it protected by the First Amendment? And the funniest part is, so this ultimately they get sued for $100 million for running this tape. So they're, so much depends on this tape. And in every single deposition, every single person that's asked, no one has actually watched it, right? Like, they're like, well, I mean, I glanced at it, but no one would admit that they watched this tape that so much depended on, because nobody actually wanted to see Hulk Hogan naked having sex with his best friend wife, which is sort of the whole legal issue at the crux of the case. But it was a very surreal experience to have to sort of, I mean, I had to sit with Hulk Hogan and ask him about this. It was weird. And then I had to ask his best friend, why did you like Hulk Hogan having sex with your wife? It was a weird thing. It was not, if the transition from marketing to philosophy was weird, the transition from philosophy to the Hulk Hogan sex tape was probably weirder still.
What was interesting was the backstory about who funded the lawsuit.
Yes.
Do you guys know who Peter Thiel is? Do you all know who he is? So, I mean, he's one guy. It's been incredibly, PayPal, right?
Yeah, so he's the founder of PayPal, and then he puts the first $500,000 into Facebook, and then he also happened to have created a company called Palantir, which is worth about $20 billion, and it's probably the sort of most high-tech defense company in the world. They do a lot of interesting kind of surveillance and data mining and all this stuff. So a billionaire multiple times over who was outed by Gawker in 2007, sort of before he'd done any of this, they wrote a really mean post that outed him as gay. And so for the next basically 10 years, he plotted his revenge. When they picked on him, he was sort of somewhat wealthy, and then he made billions and billions of dollars, and it turned out that they'd made a very bad enemy.
And they didn't know, this is for those of you who haven't read the book, he was funding Hulk Hogan's lawsuit, and the other, am I?
Yeah, so they out him as gay, which is not illegal, but it's in very bad taste. And then then he begins to plot this conspiracy. He wants to put them out of business, essentially. And so he begins to find various lawsuits that he can covertly fund against them. So yeah, so Gawker thinks that they're fighting this professional wrestler. Obviously, he doesn't have very much money. He's weird. Nobody cares about him. And they don't realize that behind the scenes, he has this blank check, and that ultimately sort of the net is closing in on them.
It is amazing.
It's a very surreal, insane story.
I'm curious, a lot of the media has reacted that, well, it's an attack against the Second Amendment, and here it is, some billionaire was able to put Gawker Media at it. What's your take on all that, since you...
Yeah, I mean, that is, we're very sensitive to the media in the sense that they're sort of the canary in the coal mine of authoritarianism. Like, well, you want to have a free press in your country. You don't want people to be able to make media that they don't like simply go away. And so it was alarming when people thought that Hulk Hogan won in this sort of landmark privacy case, they sort of celebrated. And then a few months later, when it was revealed that actually a billionaire had been behind it the whole time, it sort of took on a different color for people. It actually doesn't change anything in my mind. It's interesting that even Hulk Hogan, who was a millionaire, Peter says that Hulk Hogan was only a single-digit millionaire, which to a billionaire doesn't sound like a lot. And so that Hulk Hogan couldn't have afforded this fight on his own, and so, but he won, right? Like legally he was in the right, at least according to the jury in Florida. So I don't think it's that alarming, but it is scary. I mean, the last thing anyone would want would be to piss off a billionaire with unlimited resources to come after you. So it's sort of like, on the one hand, legally, I think it's fine. Personally, it's somewhat terrifying. And it was certainly terrifying writing a book about this person, because what if he didn't like the book? That was how
he did like the book, though, I assume.
He did not like the book. So
good enough.
Good enough, yeah.
We're good.
He hasn't sued me yet, but he also waited 10 years in the Hogan case, so I don't know what to think.
He's going to buy a media company, and who knows? Or he probably already has.
Yeah.
Well, so the questions that we have focused on are for the sake of ego is the enemy. Yeah. When I originally read that book, and I had other people read it, so the ego has always been some study of the ego from our perspective has always been too spiritual. Okay. Too woo-woo, too out there, too mindset, too all that.
It's like Freud's has this complicated definition of the ego, and there's sort of this psychological, literally the ego is, not literally because it doesn't exist, but there is a sort of a medical and a psychiatric definition of the ego. I'm not smart enough to know what that is or what it's not. I'm sort of using ego in the colloquial sense of sort of arrogance. I make a distinction in the book between sort of confidence and ego, and I think we all kind of know where that line is. We couldn't define it, but we could feel it and you certainly know when other people are in the sway of ego because they're not making good decisions. They're sort of biting off more than they can chew, and so I wanted to sort of focus on that.
And that's what I loved about the book, because you made it very practical and tactical. Yeah. And it relates to this industry, because there's a lot of people that have been riding this wave of the seller's market, and now they're coming out of it, and their egos are clouding their abilities to make clear decisions about how do I adjust, what do I do next?
I think that's right. I mean, look, nobody in this room would be able to, decide to put down several $100,000 on a real estate property or to bet on yourself or to say, I don't need a job like everyone else. I'm going to work. There is a risk in that, right? And so confidence is very important, right? If you don't believe that you can do this, you're going to have trouble doing it. But just because you believe you can do it doesn't mean that you can do it. And so that's that weird tension. So you need a confidence, right? You need the ability to have some evidence that you can do it. But then the hard part is, how can you make sure that you're not sort of taking credit for things that you're not actually responsible for? How do you, when you're, let's say it's a seller's market, so you've got this kind of tailwind that's making you seem like you're better than you actually are. What you want in those scenarios is the ability to sort of step back and see yourself objectively, so you're not becoming arrogant, you're not getting overconfident. And that's what we're all trying to do.
That makes total sense. And is ego innate to all of us? So what is it? If you could, that's a Freudian type question.
We're all, sure. There's a Freudian definition of ego. There's egotism. I think we all have the tendency to become egotistical. We all do things out of ego. Do we have to be egotistical? No, I don't think so. And in fact, I think when you meet really successful people, they're often sort of quiet and sober and calm and very self-effacing. They can see, they tend to focus relentlessly on what they can do better. So I don't think, what's interesting is that the most famous people are often the most egotistical, whereas the most successful people often don't even want you to know they exist because it makes what they do harder. Does that make sense?
Charlie Munger said, "Don't try to make yourself famous, try to make your work famous."
Yeah, that's a great line, and the more you can fly under the radar, the better, right? So we have this, but then we have this problem culturally. Is we tend to only hear about the people who want not only success but fame. So you hear about a Steve Jobs or a Kanye West or a Donald Trump because they want you to hear about them. But are they actually the most successful in their given field? Probably not, right? And so I think ego is this thing. We all have it within us. We all sort of can be led astray by it. But ideally, we want to be sort of keeping it at bay as much as possible. Because very, very rarely do we make good decisions out of ego. Ego is when we gamble on something we know we shouldn't, when we, get in some conflict that would have been easily avoidable, when we start thinking, what's really dangerous, I would say particularly in this profession, is when you start to believe you have the Midas touch, that just, because you've been successful in the past, you'll automatically be successful in the future. The sort of discipline or deliberation that you did in the past, you don't need to do that as much anymore. When you start to feel like, oh, I'll do this, I'll do that, and you start to stretch, that's when you make one of those catastrophic mistakes.
You mentioned Donald Trump, which we're not going to talk about. So help us drill down more on ego. Steve Jobs was framed as being an ego, as driven by ego, yet Mother Teresa was not.
Yeah.
Both achieved great things, and so.
Well, Steve Jobs is interesting because, and this is why it's really bad to look at someone like Steve Jobs and go, I'm going to be like him. Steve Jobs was able to get away with his ego because he was so extraordinarily talented, and you could also say that there was some luck involved, right? So, if you've read the Walter Isaacson biography of Steve Jobs, and you read about him getting fired from Apple, in retrospect, it seems like a huge mistake. But because he goes on to save Apple and is this genius. But at the time, it was absolutely the right decision. I mean, Steve Jobs was a total asshole. He was just completely out of control. His projects were late. He wasn't delivering. He was losing his mind. And so when the CEO of Apple fires him, he's making the decision that he basically has to make. He has no choice. The fact that Steve Jobs gets lucky enough to come back to Apple and rescue it, that he gets the second chance, that's a sort of a historical accident, right? So in most cases, people who are egotistical, they get in the position that Steve Jobs was in, they blow themselves and their company and their business up, and then we never hear from them again. And that's something you want to keep in mind. You don't want to go, oh, okay, it worked for Steve Jobs. It didn't work for Steve Jobs. It almost undid everything. It almost didn't work for him. And you could also argue, some of the things that Steve Jobs is infamous for, he screams at people. Was that why he was successful? Or was it that he was so talented and successful that people indulged those things, right? And so there's actually this problem now in the Silicon Valley. There's this sort of myth of what Steve Jobs was, so there's a lot of less talented people that go around imitating him, and they just can't get away with it.
Interesting. So what benefit does ego have in our lives?
Well, so in the book I sort of break it up. I have, the sort of the ascent, when you have your success, and then when you're experiencing difficulty. I would say in the latter two phases, right, when you're sort of getting your ass kicked or when you're, at the top of your game, ego has almost no benefit. You could maybe make some argument that when you're young and dumb, ego is can be somewhat adaptive in that maybe there are things that I did when I was younger that I had no business doing, but I wasn't smart enough to know that I didn't have any business doing them. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Maybe I wouldn't have written my first book if I had any idea how hard it actually was going to be to do that. So ego can kind of get you to sort of stretch yourself beyond your capacities and maybe serve some benefit. But in the long run, that's a really bad habit, right? So I sort of see it as, you look at great musicians. Sometimes, particularly early on in a musician's career, there's fooling around with drugs. And maybe these drugs are sort of fueling their creativity a little bit, or it's getting them to explore different parts of themselves that if they were totally sober and straight-laced, maybe they wouldn't. But ultimately, did drugs work out for Jimi Hendrix or Kurt Cobain or Janis Joplin? No, they didn't. So I'm saying that it's a really dangerous thing to fool around with. I'd rather have someone be a little bit more humble, a little bit more self-aware, and the ascent take a little bit longer, so that when they're successful, they're not driven by ego. Because the problem is that on your way up, you have less to lose. So if your ego blows you up, great. What's the cost? You can start over again. But now you have a company, you employ 20 people, you've got a portfolio of businesses or properties or whatever it is. Well, now if you make a stupid mistake out of ego, there's a real cost to that. And I open the book with that line from Cyril Connolly where he says that ego sucks us down like the law of gravity. Again, when you're nobody, okay, you're not that far from the ground. But what happens when you really get going? That's where it's a problem.
Makes sense.
In the same way, anger can be a great fuel, right? Like if you're going to show all these people up, you're going to shove this in your face. Maybe early on, that motivates you. But do you want to be middle-aged and still trying to stick it to the people who were mean to you in high school, or do you want to be inventing things to be mad about just to keep that going? That's a very miserable way to live, and I think ego is analogous to that. So
is there a correlation between what you're describing and the fact that, another Warren Buffett quote, now I've quoted both of them, but Warren Buffett said, we celebrate too much the comeback story. We need to celebrate where the guy made it and never lost it.
Yeah, totally.
You heard that?
Totally.
Yeah. Is that what you're describing?
Yeah, that's totally it. In the sober sort of recovering community, they talk about the 2 cars in the garage attic. Like, do you want to be the person who has to hit rock bottom, like you're homeless, living under a bridge somewhere, and then you go, oh, this isn't working. I got to get sober. Or do you want to realize it while you still have your house and you still have your cars? Do you know what I mean? And
I do.
Ideally, you want to catch these things before you've, and particularly in the real estate, you hear all these people who are like, I was flying so high and then I lost everything in the market crash, and now I'm gonna, and that's supposed to be super inspiring. But ideally, that just doesn't. You didn't have that, right?
You just summarized our morning session.
Really?
Yeah, it's completely. Awesome. Seriously.
Well, I think I actually conclude the book with it, but there's this great line from Bismarck where he's saying, any fool can learn by experience. I prefer to learn by the experiences of others. Ego, there are very few examples of ego working out positively for someone over a long timeline. And so I think we can go, oh, okay, I'm just not going to do that. I'm not going to learn that painful lesson from my own experiences.
So you said something I was just pondering. You said that a lot of the examples of successful people are people that have basically become, they've blown themselves up.
Yeah.
So maybe one of the reasons that people assume that having a big ego is part of success is because they're modeling themselves after that behavior. Did I hear you right?
Yeah. So obviously we have what's called the survivorship bias. You only hear about the people who succeeded. That's actually one of the things that I try to work on in my books. It's hard. There's not a lot of well-known stories of people who didn't make it, right? By definition, you don't hear about the people who failed. There are a fair amount of stories of people who were successful and then they blew themselves up. There's a wonderful book called $1 Billion Lessons, which I would recommend everyone read. It's sort of a bunch of, I have a bunch of book recommendations, so I'll throw them at you.
Well, this would be a good time. He's got a great book list you guys need to subscribe to. We subscribe to it. We always get your books.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So $1 Billion Lessons is just examples from business history of companies that made really big mistakes. Like you read Good to Great, all those companies, it worked for them, but you don't hear about the companies that followed similar trajectory and then failed. And then there's another one called What I Learned Losing $1 Million. And this book was about a guy in the 80s. So he lost $1 million in 1980 is worth a lot more today. So it's probably more like 10 or $15 million. But he's a stock trader who basically gets really cocky and he makes this trade and he's just, even though all the evidence is starting to run to the contrary, he can't get out of it. And so I try to look for examples of when it didn't work. And I try to learn those lessons because you can in some ways learn more from those. But yeah, you want to realize that when the people you've heard of clearly by definition have some sort of attraction
to the limelight or fame that perhaps a less representative segment of the population doesn't have, but might actually be more successful. You know, you don't when you pull up the like say the Forbes 500 or the Forbes 100, there's a huge chunk of these people that you've never heard of. You probably learn more from those people than the people that are, you know, on the cover of the magazine.
Yeah, I understand. Well, this is what we were talking about this morning, is the fact that, you know, you don't have to go from having a great 5 or 6 or 10 years to a crappy 5 or 6 or 10 years. It's almost like part of the American fabric that people like to have these ups and downs in different aspects. If it's not finances, it's health. If it's not health, it's personal issues. These are all manifestations of an ego that kind of goes unchecked.
Yeah, right. I mean, look, it's more dramatic, right? And so obviously those are the stories we talk about. It's less exciting to be like, look, this person had a good head on their shoulders, and they did good in high school, and then they did good in college, and then they started a business, and they never got divorced, and they have kids who are well-adjusted, and then they died happily at 80, right? Like, that story is not that exciting. We want, you know, we like the story of Elon Musk in the parking lot of Tesla trying to, you know, putting up these tents but it's like, that's, when you really look at it, it's like that's kind of a situation, a disaster of his own making that he's now working hard to recover from. So you want to think about how can you avoid that? Like, in a way, being boring is like a sign of being really well adjusted and successful.